Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Welcome back to The Curious Collector. It's Stuart Holbrook coming to you for episode 42. I'm so glad you could all join us for what I hope to be an interesting subject, and certainly one that everybody in the world is talking about. And it is about AI. I know you're thinking, who the heck are you to talk to us about AI? But I'm not talking to you about AI in general. I want to talk to you today about AI and its relationship to collecting. That is, how collectors can utilize it, things they should see in their research projects and their evolution as a collector where AI may benefit them, but as well where AI can work against you in many cases. And we're going to go through all of that through the whole day. And I think you're going to be shocked at my final verdict. That is AI useful? And I am going to talk to each one of you from a different level of collector to help explore the complexities of what is truly, do we dare call it, the last invention? I say that because the podcast I listened to a few months ago about AI and its intersection into our lives right now was called The Last Invention. And it basically is, as you have all been hearing in the news every day, it seems, about the incredible potential that AI could be unleashing onto our world. That is, it could cure diseases that have long eluded the greatest scientists. It could create so many different opportunities for our society and our world. But on the other hand, you're hearing the doom players out there who are saying it is the end of critical thinking, the end of the world. AI will destroy it all. And then the people who go back to talking about the Terminator movie, which I just can't in good conscience bring Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Terminator movie into the conversation about AI. I think it's not the same. But ultimately, we all know, we're hearing it, we're reading it, we're talking about it, we're even using it, and we're seeing the power that it has, and it just keeps getting bigger and more robust with every passing year. So I think it would be amiss of me not to do an episode on this to help collectors kind of rein in some of their ideas and thoughts. So, again, I ask, who am I? Who am I to talk about this? I'm not a techie. I'm not a tech dude. I have understanding of aspects of tech as it relates to particular businesses, but I do know collecting, and I feel I've got a strong command of how it can relate into collecting to share with you today. And I also did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. Okay. I told that joke to my daughter recently. It was something about, she said there's something wrong with her car. And I asked her to describe it to me. And I said, yes, I know exactly. It's probably the transmission. And she said, how do you know that? I've never seen you work on a car. And I said, because I stayed at the Holiday Inn Express last night. And she looked at me like, what? And I realized, oh no, I'm getting older. Nobody even knows what the Holiday Inn Express commercials were that were my favorite ad campaign in history ever. I used to love them, and I still watch them on YouTube sometimes just for a laugh. Anyway, I get it. I'm not here to talk to you about the tech aspects of AI. I'm not going to bring up the doom part of it, and we're not going to go into that at all. What I want to do is show you how it has intersected into our lives, and especially in our collecting lives. It is a wave. It is a wave like we have probably never experienced in humanity. And we can talk about previous waves out there in the past. The invention of the wheel. It could be electricity. It could be the telephone. It was the internet back in the 90s. And if you recall back then, as I was talking about the doom aspects of all of these great inventions and great advancements in the world, they were met with skeptics and people who said, oh my gosh, this is going to change everything to the negative. It will be horrible. I mean, many of us have the strong memory of the 90s when the internet was going to destroy us all. But I don't want to get into that in the conversation with AI because that's left to be seen. But I want to talk about it again from the context of collecting. I avoided it for a long time. I have to admit, it wasn't until about 6 months ago that I even utilized AI for anything in my life, in my daily work. Not that I use it really, obviously, for dolls. I don't feel a necessity, and we'll talk about that. But I have found some nuanced things that have helped me with AI in the area of my career as well. And we'll discuss a little bit of that. But it was about 6 months ago to a year that AI began to really creep into my conversations with people and people's conversations with me and daily interaction. And I remember starting off about a year ago, and my daughter, who I just talked about, was at a summer college level program for 2 weeks, a summer camp for high school students who were looking at eventually entering into certain specialized business degrees. And part of this program was the last 2 or 3 days, they had a Shark Tank type competition between 3 separate groups within the camp, all of them assigned to start a business, to come up with a business concept, write a business plan, write all of your marketing research thoughts up behind it, what you would need for funding, all of these things. Now, she is 17 and all of the students there were 16, 17 years old. And they came up with this plan working directly together, utilizing conventional research, utilizing books in the library, utilizing the traditional internet. And AI is not the traditional internet. So anyone who thinks it is, I'm going to break that down later on for you to understand where it is. There is an absolute division. There is a connection, but it's divided. And so she utilized all these things with her group. Well, there was another group there, and they actually utilized AI. And they were utilizing ChatGPT at the time. So very fascinating to know that in the end, the group that won was the one that used ChatGPT, the one that used AI. And my daughter at the time was really upset. She was like, that's just not fair. We actually utilized critical thinking. We actually took the time to really research deeply into it. And I agreed with her at that moment because I had not really been utilizing it on a daily basis. So ultimately, 6 months, 8 months passed. She's now entered into her junior year and will soon be a senior. And now the schools overnight are embracing AI in their work at the school and encouraging students to utilize AI for their research and their writing. And she's doing it on a daily basis. And she has actually come to embrace it and sees the incredible benefit of it and feels that her process of learning, her education has increased exponentially since she began using it. You know, I've talked to people who are in the tech industry, friends of mine, and they basically have all said the same thing, that in the coming years, there's going to be 2 people. Those who embraced AI and absolutely are excelling at what they do as a result of it, and those who didn't use AI, refused, backed away from it, and were left behind. Now, I can't tell you if that's actually the case, and I always think there's something in the middle there that could crop up, but ultimately, I'm seeing it a lot, and I'm realizing now in my own use how it is really shaping the narratives in a lot of subjects, and it's allowing you to see things differently than you may have before. Even myself, who's dealing with so many dolls across the world, so many different collectors, and I think I have a pretty good handle on analyzing particular collections, analyzing particular dolls. And then I put something into AI, and I find an angle that I actually didn't even think of before. So we'll talk a lot about that, and I'll give you some examples of different things that this has occurred for me over these past 6 months where I've really begun to embrace it. So other things began cropping up over this time, over these past 6 months, as we're seeing AI come into everything in our lives. I remember the table talk tours I was doing around the country last year, and I remember the origins of it in the first 6 months of it. I would have people in these table talk lectures ask me, Stuart, what do you think about AI for doll collectors? Is it useful? And I was kind of like, I don't know. I really didn't. I didn't know what to say. And, the first time it came up, okay, I think people accepted that. And I really said, I'm sorry, I just really don't use AI for much of anything. So I don't even know how to answer that. But then another month later, a couple weeks later, another person asked it, and then another person. And then it just seemed like everybody was asking and demanding my opinion on AI and how doll collectors could utilize it. So that was the point where I began to say, hey, I really need to kind of figure this out and kind of have a discussion with people and what I have discovered during this research. But other things were happening all at the same time. We were playing around at lunch one time, my brother Luke and I, and then my mother Florence Theriault, the founder of Theriault. And we were talking about AI, and I was saying, I don't use it. Florence says, I've never even looked at it. And Luke said, well, I love it. It's been really fascinating as a research tool. And he then said, hey, let's actually see what AI says about Florence Theriault. And it had this wonderful, glowing review of all of her years of research, the books she's written, the catalog she's done, the YouTube videos, how she's considered one of the leading experts in the research projects in France and Germany and all over. And it was incredible byline. And then at the end, it said, Florence Theriault unfortunately passed away in 2015. I can't make this up. I mean, it was like a moment of what? And even Luke was shocked. He had never done it before. So all of us were in a complete state of shock. So that should be a warning. And we'll talk about that don't believe everything you necessarily read that AI gives you as current information, because I assure you Florence is alive and well and rocking out the catalogs at nearly 85 now. So another encounter, again, to tell you how AI has creeped into our daily business world. We had recently an auction about 2 months ago, and a client bought about 4 or 5 pieces at the auction online and called up on Monday to pay her invoice and said, oh, and I'll be paying only the 12% buyer's premium, not the 15% buyer's premium. And so our accounting department was like, well, I don't understand. The buyer's premium is 15%. And she responded, oh, no, I know that you give a 3% discount if paying by check or cash or wire transfer if I don't use a credit card. And they're like, that hasn't been done in 10 years, 15 years. I don't even know how long it's been. And they're like, well, that's not possible. And she said, where did you get this information? And the woman said, from ChatGPT. And so somehow AI return on how much is Theriault's buyer's premium was returning that you get a discount if you pay by cash or a check, which has not been the case for many years. So another little lead into this and what we'll talk about through this episode, in that information could be correct in one sense, but it was correct 15 years ago. But for some reason, the data picked up the incorrect current information. So we're seeing this all the time. I'm getting countless AI written descriptions of items that people want us to sell at auction with an email, with a photograph, and then a whole absolutely overwhelming description of the simplest doll in the world, which I could have easily just been able to identify from the photograph alone. So it will have this glowing, the patina of this particular doll shines in its glorious light, and the eyes are beautiful glass eyes. And look at this pristine body and costume, which just enhance the overall presentation of this fabulous piece. And it's a Bilo. I mean, it's like, wow, that is the greatest description of a Bilo I've ever seen. Maybe I'll start using that, and I might get more than $50 for a Bilo. We'll give it a try. Ultimately, it's so funny to see how absolutely hyperbolic you can find AI generated descriptions on particular pieces. It might work if the item is really rare, probably still will be over the edge, but however, I will say this, it gets really crazy when it's on a doll that is a bread and butter doll that collectors, even non-collectors, see quite often out on the marketplace. So these are some of the funny things that have occurred. We'll talk about all of this and how it relates to our discussion today. So with that, let's get this started off with, I think, where we all need to understand the pros and cons of using AI in your collecting. It is absolutely, without a doubt, a really important part, I believe, to the evolution of every collector, certainly from the beginning stage where it may be the most useful, but however, the most dangerous, and leading right up into the expert stage where you may have immediately in your process of your own AI, that is you, and all the knowledge that you've developed over these years, there may be ways that you can think about something a little bit differently. I think every single one of these levels of collector has use for it. However, there are pros and cons, and let's walk through them, and I'm going to give you on some of them some different examples that I've experimented with over these past 6 months of research that I've done myself. So the first pro, the first benefit, the first really, I think, useful aspect of artificial intelligence, AI, for a collector is it is truly like having 1,000 research assistants at your disposal 24/7. Imagine that. It's crazy when you think about it, that before you were kind of in this alone, other than maybe a few little contacts you had out there in the world, the books that you had, you were kind of thrown into this wild west of developing knowledge through the old line of it took a lot of time and it took a lot of work. You had to go find a book. You had to get that book. You had to read that book. You had to ask questions. You might have lurked, if it was the internet age and the beginning of the internet age, lurked in chat rooms or forums or on Facebook and trying to get information where you could. And it took months, years in many cases, to be able to learn something because you were totally on your own. Well, imagine now that you have at your disposal thousands of research assistants that you can summon at any time, day or night, and within minutes, often seconds, they can build a summary based on what you have fed them as your needs and requirement for research to gather all of these things that you want to know about a particular subject. In this case, we talk about collectibles and in dolls, and that you can learn exponentially faster. What took collectors years, especially at the beginning stage, now takes, in some cases, seconds to get a basic foundation knowledge. So again, keep that in mind. I always love to relate to people that AI is not the internet. It is 1,000 research assistants who are scouring the internet on your behalf and compiling the information it finds into a summary for you that's cohesive and readable, and that will help guide you in your thought process on this particular subject. But of course, I'm going to throw in the caveat, and we'll talk about this a little later, in the cons. Do not trust that that information is entirely correct. And we're going to address the idea of critical thinking is behind every part of your interaction with AI. AI is compiling what it can find, but your critical thinking is determining ultimately, is it accurate? Is it plausible? Do I need to go a step further and now take this research to a new level? That is consult with books. That is consult with experts. That is looking into the internet myself in different sections to find out if this really is correct. It's given me a summary. It's given me a foundation and a starting point, but I've got to dig further. But I'm jumping the gun. We're going to talk about that. But this is especially this 1,000 research assistants, and you are the editor, call it. And I think it's like 1,000 paralegals and you're the lawyer. Ultimately, it's up to you to then take that information and, as I said, do the vetting process on your own. But it certainly speeds things up. Now, if you're a neophyte to a particular category, so you might be an expert collector, but your collecting has been specifically related to one particular genre. Let's say you collect French fashion dolls or German characters, and you've got a pretty strong knowledge there, but you kind of want to explore a new area. And so let's come up with a concept. And I used an example here in my studies that I want to talk about to see how AI responded and to see what kind of information it presented to me. So I took the example of Nancy Ann's storybook dolls. And this is very nuanced, very specialized, and has its own little subculture of collectors out there. And I thought it was a great one to test, again, the limits or non-limits of AI in giving me information. So I presented the concept of, I'm a new collector, and what can you tell me about Nancy Ann's storybook dolls? I would like to collect them. Where do I start? It gave an absolutely fascinating and comprehensive, I got to tell you, almost straight on 100% correct foundation. Not deep diving into a lot of the really nuanced stuff, but a great foundation with which to start. It laid out an entire outline of, for me, here are the 5 levels of the Nancy Ann storybook, starting with the Judy Ann early bisque models, the first ones, leading right up to the hard plastic in the later years, which it denoted all the different market levels of this different evolution of Nancy Ann's storybooks. It gave the history of the company. Everything that I read was absolutely accurate. It gave pricing comparables, comps that were out there that it could find online, and where the market has been trending in certain years, where it's been falling behind on other things. And I mean, I was absolutely gobsmacked at how perfectly it summarized it and how wonderfully it gave me a foundation as this new collector, in quotations, of Nancy Ann's storybook dolls, of what to look for, where to find it, and how to proceed from there. And now, was I ready to immediately dive right into the marketplace and I'm going to go buy a Nancy Ann right now in 5 minutes and I know what to look for? Of course not. But as I said, that summary and that foundation was laid out. I had a much quicker entry point into getting more information. And here's what's really interesting with AI. Now, I want to interject this because I think it's important for people to understand what I use for AI and the platform that I particularly engage with. I use Anthropic's Claude. This was recommended to me by some of my tech friends 6 months ago when I first started out in this exploration of AI and collecting. I was told basically that Claude is the best because not only is its data, its ability to parse data, scour data on the internet, one of the most robust systems in the world, but it has the most ethical standards. And I've noticed this throughout in everything that I've done in the research on dolls with Claude to test this out, that it is really approaching it from this ethical standpoint in that it presents caveats every single step of the way. While it will lay things out to you, and here's my summary, it says, however, nothing will compare to an expert's conclusion to any of these particular subjects. Nothing will compare to an expert's eye. Nothing will compare to further deep diving research on your own to come up with your own hypothesis and your own analysis of a particular doll or marketplace. So I find that to be very refreshing because that's one of the things you hear about AI. Oh, it just gives you terrible information and it sounds convincing. And this is true. It's actually a term for it. It's called AI hallucinations. And I love that. It's really quite dramatic, but we'll go with it. AI hallucinations. One of my tech friends, he has a different name for it. He says, sometimes AI, it's drunk. And so it gives you these definitive, absolutely convincing and very well written summaries of a particular subject, and they're completely wrong. It's completely off the wall wrong. And you know this because you're testing it. Now, imagine you're a neophyte, you're a newbie, you're just coming in and you asked AI something about dolls and it gave you something completely off the wall wrong. But it was convincing, it's tricked you, and you believe it now, and you go off and you pay $5,000 for a BILO. Bless you, please. So it can actually lead you down the wrong path. That is, again, why critical thinking is at the foundation. And that's why I use Claude from Anthropic because, and this is not an endorsement, you use whatever you want. I'm just telling you what I have used and where the summaries that I discuss with you have come from. But I find it to be the one that's very refreshing in really every time telling me, hey, don't believe everything I say. Here's what I think, but you need to go out further and dig up more information. Again, laying out that foundation. So on the Nancy Ann Storybook dolls, I was, again, absolutely amazed at the idea of how it could provide for me as that beginning collector this perfect start. Things that I wouldn't have even known where to begin. If I found a Nancy Ann storybook and saw it, the only thing I could rely on basically as a new collector back in the day was maybe I knew somebody who was knowledgeable about Nancy Ann and gave me a foundation idea of what to look for and what the different eras are and what the market is like. But if you didn't have that person, you had to kind of go out and find, is there even a book on this? And you find out, okay, there is a book. And then you order that book, as I mentioned earlier on in the podcast, and you take the time to read it. But now you have that laid out foundation. So you may still get that book, and you probably should. But reading that book will go so much faster and with a lot more clarity in base knowledge on Nancy Ann's as one example. And it could be any subcategory, any broad category, any nuanced one, anything out there. AI's got pretty much an answer to everything, or at least in the case of Claude, I found, will speculate but tell you it's a hypothesis. So that takes us to the third pros of AI and how it relates to collecting. And I think this may be the most important one. But interestingly enough, it is the one that I think collectors haven't thought about yet, and I actually discovered purely by accident. That is, AI actually can open up a new thought process on a particular item or a particular subject in ways you didn't even think about. That is, it can cross-reference multiple data points where we tend to, especially, and this is where I think it comes into play, not as much for a neophyte collector, though it does work for them, but even an expert collector can benefit from AI in looking at a doll and giving its thoughts on it. So dolls they're three-dimensional. As you know, I've coined that phrase years ago that it's a three-dimensional figurative art. So ultimately, you're looking at a lot of different aspects of the doll rather than just a one-dimensional, let's say, comic book, which is so much easier for AI to be able to look at and assess for you. But a doll has many different elements. And I've noticed that it is really good at picking up on certain things that you may not have paid attention to on that doll that are a benefit to the piece or that actually gives you some sort of historical context that you didn't even really pay attention to. And there's two different takeaways from this. I decided I was going to test out the ability for AI to look at a photograph of a doll, identify that doll, and tell me more about it. So I entered in a photograph for Claude of a rare 34-inch, I think, exhibition size Gerbruder Heubach character that's coming to auction in July from the Gail Cook collection. It is a fabulous molded hair version of a never before seen in this size Gerbruder Heubach. Never before seen to me, I should interject. So I entered the picture in to see what would Claude say. So from the identification standpoint, it was not the best. So it was not able to specifically tell me who made this doll. However, it did give me three potential choices. One, it said it appears to be the work of one of these three makers, Gerbruder Heubach, Kestner, or Kamer and Reinhardt. Well, it did correctly guess Gerbruder Heubach as one of the three, but it wasn't definitive. But I was really glad that it didn't just jut out Gerbruder Heubach or Kamer and Reinhardt. It actually offered three potential companies that could have made this doll. And then it suggested I take a photograph of the marking, which it may be able to cross-reference to some data it could find. I did not. I let Claude know that it is a Gerbruder Heubach, and it then went on to pontificate about Gerbruder Heubach dolls and things that I already knew, but a neophyte might find very interesting, or somebody who is researching a family doll might find interesting about the company. But then it was very fascinating, something I never asked it to do. something I never even mentioned in the conversation. I don't want to call it a conversation. When people talk about AI like it's a person, it seems kind of creepy, but it just is a natural reaction. And that's not what I'm really referring to. But in this chat with Claude, I never mentioned anything about the outfit. And yet, lo and behold, Claude started going off about that costume. It happens to be dressed in a Scandinavian, I don't know what the purpose was particularly for it, but a Scandinavian styled costume that is of the period and really dramatic and gives this doll such an incredible presence. I didn't mention that. And Claude went out about that costume and said, what really intrigues me about this doll is not only the particular portraiture of the face, but the fact that this costume, which I have taken the time to identify as of Norwegian origin, and it gave me the particular name of the costume. It gave me then what it speculates is one of two regions that the costume could have come from. And then it showed me different features on the costume that led to its speculation of this hypothesis of the origins of the outfit. So I asked Claude, already knowing the answer to this, and I was really interested in how it came up with this without being prompted. And I asked Claude then, well, that's really interesting. So given the size of 34 inches and this specialized, unique Norwegian costume, as you identified it to be, why do you think this doll was created in this costume? Or why do you think this costume was placed on this doll? And so Claude said, well, it's very clear. A 34-inch sized piece like this was not necessarily or probably not made as any sort of childhood plaything. It was most likely made either as an exhibition or display model. And as such, I would speculate and hypothesize that the costume was utilized for a specific display or exhibition relating to Norway, Scandinavia, or possibly even made for a heritage display in the U.S., where the doll came from, out of a collection, Gail Cook's collection, that was taking place in the early 1900s in one of the heavily Scandinavian populated areas of the United States, like Minnesota or Wisconsin or North Dakota. All really good hypothesis. The type of things an advanced collector would discuss with this doll. And it was not outlandish. It was all very well framed. It came with a lot of backing as to why it was speculating on these particular areas of this one example of the Gebruder Heubach and that Norwegian costume. And all of it, as I said before, very plausible and exactly how advanced collectors would be discussing this. So I found this to be really, really unique. And here's the thing. I know pretty significant amount about dolls. I know I can identify the Gebruder Heubach in a split second faster and better than Claude ever can in knowing its origins, where it came from, the time frame, how it was made, all of that. But I don't know textiles that well. Even Florence Theriault, who's cataloged millions of dolls over 55 years and knows all of the nuances of dolls in themselves, she still struggles a lot of times with textiles and the particular origins of provincial costumes. That is, to exactly be able to relate the particular region or village even it came from, in the case of France many times. So here is an opportunity for utilizing AI to analyze textiles and see, are they of the period? What region do they come from? Does it have a particular provenance? When I was putting this together, I was thinking about Rosalie Weil and the auction we did a couple of years ago now of her museum. And some of you who follow that auction might remember we had this incredible set of dolls from the Crees Indians in Canada, and one of the First Nations tribes in Canada. And these dolls were extraordinary in their original costumes. And costumes of the Crees Indians are almost extinct at this point. You cannot find any period costumes back then because they tended to trade all of their outfits and costumes to the English settlers in the 1600s who came to the Hudson Bay region of Canada in exchange for what they felt were more practical Western style outfits, and started wearing those. And all of the old outfits were just thrown away or given to some of the British soldiers and the British traders there at the time. And so there has not been a lot of documentation on these Crees Indians outfits. And that here are these dolls displayed in them. So what is incredible is that I remember reading the documentation and working on the museum and preparing it for auction, that Rosalie Weil and her daughter Shelley had spent years communicating with any experts they could find on Cree's Indians costumes, and finally did find one, but it took 2 or 3 years of back and forth. I mean, we're talking letter writing to be able to get to the conclusion that these were outfits of that Cree's Indian First Nation tribe, and that they were probably 1600s, late 1600s, early 1700s, and that they are incredibly rare and one of the very few documented costumes remaining from the Cree's Indians. So imagine with AI in the aspect of textiles, in being able now to do what took Rosalie Weil years before, you can potentially do in seconds, in being able to have them identify the particular region that costume is from. And Florence is always talking about how it's so painstakingly difficult to identify exactly. She remembers spending a month in France at one point on a research project, going around to all the textile museums and meeting with experts all over France. And what she learned is they don't really know either. They're not really all that great in being able to specifically identify maybe villages that style came from, or what particular elements within that costume denoted a certain village, because they all had identifying factors. They didn't even really have a good database of it. But now AI is beginning to compile all of this data to be able to look at something like the costume from Norway and give a good, again, hypothesis as to the region and the potential towns that this could have originated from because of certain features. Now, with that said, am I going to believe what Claude said on that Gebruder Heubach? Am I just going to take that as gospel? That's it? Wow, thank you. I know the town in Norway that this was made. Of course not. But it has given me a starting point in which to dig further, to then go online or look through books or talk to an expert and say, here's what I have found so far in my research. Am I off? Am I close? Where am I with this? And see if it's correct. This is powerful stuff. And that leads us to the next point as far as a pros of AI, and that is useful for assisting you in developing a framework in which to write articles or books on a particular subject that you're passionate about. So here's the deal. Listen, I am not advocating, nor do I ever want to see AI writing research articles, books, or anything on a subject. I don't want to call it cheating, but I would say there's nothing in there that is developing a human connection to a particular subject. And critical thinking and that human touch is always going to be necessary in utilizing the power of AI. You don't want to use them to write it, but you can use it to make a prep guide, make a flow chart. You can fact check and then add your own style and thoughts to what it comes up with. Don't have it write your article. Have it suggest to you what are some of the factors and areas that you should touch on. And it may actually open up an idea of a particular discussion topic that you hadn't thought of. I'll tell you, I use it now. In the last 3 episodes, I've been utilizing Claude to help, not writing, as you can tell, because I ramble on forever. I clearly don't have a script for any of my podcasts. So it's not that, but it helps develop a framework and a different sort of a timeline of what the podcast can potentially address. I take that, I look at it. Some of I say, you're ridiculous. I'm not going to talk about that, or this doesn't fit there. And I then frame it to my own words and my own thoughts, utilizing a few of the things that Claude has come up with and developing elements of, obviously, the majority of my own thoughts and putting them all together. It speeds things along. I can do now preparation for a podcast in half the time it used to take me. And it's not cheating. It's not doing the work. It's just helping me open up some avenues and some thought processes that I may not have seen before. So if you write articles or write books, it's an incredible tool, again, to be able to develop an outline, to be able to develop some thoughts that you want to be sure to address, to organize all of your outline. It can be really, really great in that aspect. And I think for every collector, writing of articles, or if you can get a book published on a particular subject that you're passionate about, you're helping to then contribute as well to AI's knowledge of that later on in the future. And you are still doing it with your own words. You are still going through the painstaking process, but you're able to speed it up. And with that, I think we'll be able to see more published works on more nuanced topics out there that otherwise might have gone without any articles because the person just didn't have the time to do it in the past. But now they can speed it up a little bit and they'll be able to actually contribute out there. So I would like to see even more research articles being done by collectors utilizing AI to help it through the outline process and the organizational aspect of what to put out there in that particular article. So the last pro actually comes as a product of my asking Claude the very question of, what do you think you offer collectors as your greatest attribute, and where do you think you can help them the most? So I was curious to hear it from Claude itself, to be able to understand his perspective. And it came up with something that I had never really thought of, but yet it's something that I discuss all the time in lectures, in my writings, and in the podcast. And that is, Claude can help you, or AI can help you, to potentially open up doors to see other areas of collecting that you may have never thought of before. That is different categories and subcategories that can keep your collecting fresh. Now, if you go back to some of my previous podcasts, and there was one that was called The Road of a Collector Should Never Be Straight. So the difficult part is kind of finding what items out there could you potentially be interested in. A lot of times it's just been, you stumbled on it somewhere along the line. You saw it online. You saw it at an auction. A dealer had one. You saw it at a museum somewhere, and you became fascinated by that and you collected it. But it may have taken you years to find that item and realize, oh, this is a really cool category that is a perfect adjunct to what I'm doing already. So I asked Claude then, okay, well, let's play a game. I am a Kewpie collector. And I've been collecting Kewpies for 20 years, and I'm an expert at Kewpies. But I really want to start finding a new category to collect. But I don't want it to be too far out there. I'd like it to relate somehow to what I'm collecting. And what would you suggest? And if you've listened to that previous podcast of The Road of a Collector Should Never Be Straight, you will remember that I used Kewpies as an example of that, in that it's very sad that a collector has to collect such a happy thing, but narrow in on that all these years, because eventually it gets stale. You need something different. You need something to kind of lighten up your collecting, to bridge things over a little bit, to keep it fresh, to build a new community, to have more challenges, have more fun. And so I mentioned that, why don't Kewpie collectors collect Googlies? Why don't Kewpie collectors go into some of Rose O'Neill's artwork as well? Why don't Kewpie collectors go into small little novelty fun Albus dolls, or some of the 1920s American illustrator work that related to eventually doll production, and even earlier the 1920s. And you can look at Grace Drayton, you can look at Grace Story Putnam, you can look at early Palmer Cox drawings and illustrations that led to those items. All of this relates, and I had mentioned all of these things in that podcast. Lo and behold, I could not believe it. Claude can't listen to my podcast unless I put a transcript in. I already tested this, so it could never do an assessment or anything, because it's not able to listen to a podcast or access transcripts, because I tested this. So it didn't get it from me. And you know what? It came up with exactly those categories. The first one being the one I've always suggested, that if you're a Kewpie collector, why are you not collecting Googlies as well? It's a different category, but it relates. It's an extension. They're fun, and it can open up a whole new community and a whole new subject for you. So then Claude then began to go on about Googlies and the history of Googlies and why Googlies relate and how it can help you with these Googlies. And so you can continue to pose questions to it. Tell me about the different categories of Googlies, some of the prominent makers. What are the value bases on comps on QPs in the marketplace today? And for a collector, if you are a collector and you are seeking out a new subject, this can absolutely turbocharge your ability to find that subject so much faster and keep collecting fresh and exciting for you all the way to the end of life. And that is really, really great tool to AI. It becomes a bridge between rooms in the house a collector builds in finding you these connected patterns and connected items. So with that, it leads to the cons. I don't know why we had to have dark music in there. I got to get Tammy to start being able to insert music in here to give it a really dramatic feel. But now we go to the cons of AI. And I don't know why I'm imagining in my head right now Arnold Schwarzenegger and the robots and all of these things. And yes, there are cons, but they're not quite as dramatic and as wild as Terminator or any of these things when it relates to collecting. There may be in other areas, but for collecting, the cons are actually pretty much common sense things. Now, the first one we've already touched on, and that is AI having its hallucinations, where it states with confidence its determination of a particular assessment of an item or attribution of an item without any caveats, without any sort of warning that, hey, I could be wrong. It's like, no, here it is. You have this. For a beginning collector or somebody who is just trying to research a family doll or maybe stumbled on something in an estate sale, whatever, that can be tricky and it can be dangerous because it will, as I said before, sound really convincing. But for an experienced collector, I think it will become very obvious. Or even a collector with a little bit of experience under their feet might sense that, well, I don't know. I think something's kind of wrong about this. So I tested, again, some more items with Claude to see how it would determine this piece and what it would determine it to be, but as well to see how it would address the caveats behind it. So I, again, uploaded a photograph and said, Claude, please identify this doll. Now, what it was is a Steiner Toffling, which some people wrongly refer to as a Machman, but a Steiner Toffling with the multiple bisque parts throughout, and that will be upcoming from the Gail Cook collection in July. I posted a photo of this into Claude and said, identify it. So Claude came back and it was way off. Like, I mean, okay, I don't want to say it was in another dimension. It identified it as French. It identified it as 1860s, but it definitively classified this as a French poupée. So really not at all correct. So it did have a caveat. It did say, I'm not seeing all aspects of it, and you should have an expert look at this piece and confirm that it is or isn't a French poupée. And then went off and talked about French poupées and why it thought it was a French poupée. So I corrected Claude, and Claude said, oh, wow, now I see it. I realized that I mistakenly took the construction of the head and bisque shoulder as being more prominent in a poupée, but now I understand that it is the Steiner Toffling, and it went off on a whole history of that and of the Tofflings and gave me a market analysis. Only because I knew, and I was testing Claude, was I able to correct it. However, if you're a new collector, I would think you'd probably know the difference between a Toffling and a French fashion, so I think you'd be okay. But if you're a family doll owner and you found it in the attic and it was your great-great-grandmother's piece and you want to research what it is, you could be instantly misled at that point. Now, that comes to play into the fact that if you are that unknowledgeable person in the particular market that do not take it for gospel as to what AI is telling you it is, you can take it and then say, all right, let me look at it. And you go back and you look at French poupées and you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't look like a French poupée. This looks nothing like a Gaultier or anything along those lines. So you can then go back, and this is where it becomes really important. You have to have a conversation, not in a classic sense like a conversation with another person, but you have to keep prodding AI and challenging it in your research, because you will find, just like I did, I opened the door to another possibility. And I realize now what I should have done is say, to test AI on this, is should have said, no, I don't see where it's a French poupée. What else could it be? To see what else it would come up with. So anyway, the point being on the cons, AI is going to have hallucinations. It's not going to give you the right answer. And it will especially be tricky and dangerous when you're getting into something really rare, really unusual, very, very nuanced, like a Steiner Toffling, that is not your commercially recognizable piece, like a French poupée or a French bébé even, that you're going to find AI is going to more accurately, not always, but more accurately identify, at least as to the classification of what type of piece it is. Now, next, coming up on the cons aspect of AI, let's talk about pricing. And because a lot of people do use AI to compile data and information in the market on a particular category of dolls or particular model of doll. You'll see this a lot of times prior to auctions. And I think it's a great, useful tool for people to be able to, it should be in a prose that actually you use it for pricing comps. But again, it has to come with critical thinking, and it has to come with an understanding of a few things related to AI in the area of its analyzing pricing. You could have a geometriste as an example, and you can find that AI may tell you that values can reach as high as $34,000 without really disclosing as well that others often bring $9,000. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts. And the same model doll can have a vast disparity in pricing because there are so many different factors that go into a three-dimensional object and what its potential market value can be. So, AI can't see that. And you're just telling it. And that's why, again, the more information you feed into your particular AI platform, the better it might be able to zero in on a more comprehensive value perspective, let's call it. You just put in, tell me what a size 9 geometriste is worth. It's going to be kind of all over the place, and it's not going to be giving you a really clear picture of the market. But if you're looking at a geometriste and it's in an original Gemot costume, signed Gemot shoes, original body, original wig, has Gemot jewelry, has a provenance from an original owner and the family history behind it, and you feed that into AI, it actually might give you a better, clearer idea of the value of that particular piece. So the con being that if you don't put all the information in, you're not going to get a real clear idea of value. Even if you do put in all the information, it could go to one extreme or the other. It may find the $9,000 examples and think that's more of the prominent pricing pattern for a geometriste. Or it could find the ones that sold for $30,000, $32,000, $34,000, and it could determine that that's more of the pricing. Ultimately, this is a guideline. It should give you a framework, just like the old price guides. You didn't rely on those, although people did, but you shouldn't have relied on those to determine what a market value is on a piece that you're looking at that you really love. It should serve maybe more as just a guideline example of what some have brought in the past. And the other thing, too, is that you have to keep in mind that these pricing trends, the comps that it finds in data, is not often or ever really fresh information. The data that goes into AI, it lags behind by months. I mean, you can find 6 months sometimes of information that is missing, that is recent as to items that were sold, that is not gauging that there's a recent, let's call it market uptick on a certain particular category. Maybe geometristes have gone wild in the last 6 months and the pricing has gone way up. I'm not saying it has. I'm just using it as an example. And the ultimate data that AI is pulling up is from a year ago and a very different pricing pattern. So be careful of that. The other thing, too, that's really fascinating in analyzing pricing comps, and this is another test and another way to approach AI, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but giving you, as I mentioned before, suggestions for collecting, and it might be looking for affordable suggestions in collecting. And I used an example of this with Claude to present it with this question. I love Theriault, but I can't afford Theriault poupées or their accessories. What would you suggest to me as another particular area that I could collect that I could financially afford that are similar? And it was really good in giving me 3 suggestions of Gaultier fashions, entry-level Gemot fashions, entry-level Bru and Berrois, as 4 examples that might be in that $1,000 to $10,000 range, that also have accessories and costumes that were made by some of the boutiques in Paris, not Theriault, obviously, but other boutiques. And you can collect in the same sort of light in creating vignettes and creating scenes and displaying other items with it. So it gave me a really good suggestion in that. But then I asked it, I said, well, I don't understand. You seem to be missing the one greatest alternative to Theriault that are more affordable, and that is Romer. And it came back and said, yes, I understand. However, Romers I don't see as a necessarily affordable approach to collecting French fashions in the same manner one would collect Theriaults. I consider it just a next notch down in pricing, and as such is still getting into the realm of the Theriault valuations. And so you had asked me for more economical alternatives to a Theriault. I see Romer as not economical in that sense, but certainly you are correct in that it would be more approachable in being able to see items in the 10 to 20,000 range instead of often 20,000 and above. So I thought that was really great. That one actually was helpful, and it did present some alternatives, but I was really intrigued how it answered the Romer part of it when I pushed it a little bit further. And that leads us into the next one of the cons, and that's understand that well-documented, and we touched on this already, but just going to reaffirm this one more time, well-documented and common items are going to have a far better level of information available to your AI research assistant. Those are going to be easy, and they're probably going to get a lot of stuff right when it comes to those items. They're going to give you a whole detailed list of bylaws and bylaw collecting and types of bylaws, and I'm sure that's going to be accessible, and it's going to be pretty spot on. And probably a photo identification of a bylaw is going to be pretty much good to go. But when you get into very unusual or niche objects, it's going to be far less reliable. And then the question comes to be, do you even know if you're a person dealing with a family item, a family heirloom, and you're trying to get it assessed? Do you even know if it's a common item or not? That's what you're trying to figure out. So you don't even have that going for you. But if you're a collector, you should have an understanding that if you're trying to get information on something really vague, like we used the Steiner Toffling earlier, you're going to have far less reliable information coming out. So be careful of that. This is a really important one to always keep in mind, and why I've said critical thinking and the human aspect is very much at the forefront of making sure you utilize AI correctly and to its fullest potential. Remembering that AI doesn't know what it doesn't know, but it often won't tell you when it's guessing. And often it is guessing, forming hypothesis. And why I tell you that I like Claude, and that at least it tends to relate that concept to you throughout in saying, hey, this is a hypothesis. Moving on to the next con, hey, AI, and this is really important to talk about, and it really should have been in the introduction of separating AI information from the human aspect of collecting, and that is AI can't feel what Catherine Peterson, the great collector, once called the weight of a doll. That is, it doesn't hold that doll in its hands. It may have read every book in the world. It may have read every article ever written on any subject out there, but it's never held a doll. It's never actually really felt what that doll is. It hasn't looked at it within the context of your collection. It doesn't have emotions to be able to determine if that doll is correct for you. So it can't feel the weight of a doll. It can't determine the age necessarily or detect condition issues easily. it can't factor in all of those emotional parts of collecting that are really at the very root of what you're doing. That is, it can't tell if a doll makes your heart sing. It can give you ideas of why it might. It can tell you the importance of it. It can tell you history that may help you relate to it more, but it's not going to make that ultimate determination. These are personal and deeply connected emotions that a collector feels towards an item that only the collector can determine, not AI. And that leads us into photo identification. And we've been talking about this, and I told you some examples, and I really do encourage some of you to play a little bit with this in doing some photographs into AI to see some of the returns and see some of the hypothesis and analysis that it has on photos. And it will help you learn to rely on certain things and definitely steer away from other areas of trying to utilize AI as your eyes, in quotations. It can maybe offer some value to the very basics, but it's never in that photo identification going to be able to judge a doll in total. And we get all the time people who are sending in photos of a doll, family heirloom. They utilized AI photo identification and told them they had a 19th century French doll, and it's a Gorham doll from 1975. It's really not great at it. It's okay, but it's not great. And furthermore, it can't provide you with the idea of condition or looking at, it's not going to identify restoration. If it's a really good reproduction, it's clearly never going to see that. So you've got a lot of different factors in there that only the human eye, only an expert eye is going to be able to assess these things. Look, AI is not going to speed up the 10,000 hours, the tipping point of knowledge of where you can really begin to develop instincts, instinctual feelings about things. You can touch it and you can look at it and you instantly know. It's never going to do that for you. It can help speed it up a little bit. It can help offer some clues. It can help you to look at things differently than you have before in some cases, but it's never going to speed up your experience over years and how you are able to see condition aspects or the positive of little nuances or variations that could make that doll even rarer. So take photo identification, parts of AI with a grain of salt and be cautious on what it's telling you. Another caveat, warning, I guess, is to be really careful to watch out for AI-generated documentation or writing like provenance or attributions that sound really convincing, that this person has developed this whole backstory of this particular doll that really is romantic, really is fantastic, and it legitimizes in your mind what could be very questionable attributions, because AI is good at writing a lot of this stuff, and it's good at creating scenarios behind a particular piece, hypothesis. And I've tested it with Claude, and it was remarkable, some of the things they were able to write. Now, again, advanced collectors, you're probably going to recognize things right away. You're going to know that, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense, or I know what this is, and it's not what it's claiming it to be. But for the new collector, it can be particularly dangerous in having this beautifully worded provenance or attribution or hypothesis as to the origins of the doll that sounds so convincing and that you could necessarily fall into. This is why your source, your contact list of who you buy from, and your critical thinking should go into play always, and not just relying on AI-generated documentation. Lastly, just keep in mind, a new collector armed with AI research may feel more expert than they actually are because of all of this really well-worded, really nicely hypothesized information that's developed that you're reading, and you're feeling like, okay, I'm learning it all right here, right now, and in 2 weeks, I'm going to be out there and be an expert. You know, that old saying, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. And it is very much so in collecting, and that you really do need to have experience in that 10,000 hours that I've talked about out there in the field to really understand the nuances that AI is not going to give you and the instincts that you will develop over time. It's going to help you greatly. It's going to absolutely accelerate your learning process far more than collectors of the 80s, 90s, or early 2000s. But be careful with it. You are not as expert as AI may make you feel. Now, we're going to speed along here because I know I've been informed I'm up to over an hour now, and I don't want this to ramble on to 2 hours. You know, it's so funny. Every time I do a podcast, I always think, gosh, could I even fill 30 minutes with this, with what I have? And it ends up being over an hour. And so every single time. So my apologies for dragging on, but hang in there with me because I think I've got a few more important things to go over. So we're going to go into very quickly running through what I call the 5 important rules when using AI. So you've got the pros and cons, but what about actually using it? What should you do? How should you engage with it? Well, the first one is use AI to ask better questions, both of yourself in collecting and experts you work with. You don't use it to get final answers. It gives you a point to be able to go further and talk to people. And we've addressed this and talked about this a lot through the episode, so I'm not going to go back and rehash over it again. But remember, important rule, use AI to ask better questions to yourself and the experts you work with, not to give you definitive answers. Important rule number 2, cross-check everything. Just like an editor at the New York Times is going to probably have 10 researchers working under them to come up with all of the different, quote, facts. It is ultimately up to that editor to parse through everything, to look through everything and determine, is this really correct? I don't think this is right. I think we need to go back and recheck this again or go to a different source and make sure. You have to cross-check everything out there. You can do it with books. You can do it with traditional internet searches that maybe AI was not able to access. Remember, a lot of stuff behind paywalls, AI can't access. AI is not going to see. So you may have a subscription to a well-known antique doll magazine. Could be Doll News, Antique Doll Collector, any of them. And you might be able to then go in and access information that is not able to be pulled out by AI to confirm, is that correct or not? Third, be specific and thorough in your questions with AI. Vague input equals vague output. Don't settle for just one answer as well. After the first response you get regarding a question you have, ask it another question related, challenge it, keep prodding it, keep presenting it with your alternative thinking if you have one. If you doubt it, tell AI why you doubt what it's saying is correct and ask it, what else could you be missing in this? And see how it responds. Present every possible scenario, not just the rose-colored glasses one. Your goal is not to make sure that AI validates what you are thinking, but that it can challenge your thinking a little bit. So as such, you've got to be open to that and giving it as much information as you have into everything. If you're researching a particular doll, everything you know, everything about that doll, everything in the size, the body, everything that you can put in there will help it give you a clearer and better response. And then don't stop there. Keep pushing for more and more information. It's actually quite fun. 4, use AI for the categories you know the least about. Now, I know you're saying, well, if I know the least about it, how can I trust it? Because you are going to cross-check. You are going to use it as a foundation and find out, is it hallucinating or is it giving some pretty spot-on good tips like it did for me with Nancy Ann storybooks? I'm not collecting Nancy Ann storybooks, so don't worry. But I just use it as an example. Nancy Ann storybooks is one of those nuanced areas and categories that, sure, I can identify them from a basic sense, but I don't know a lot of the nuances. So that's why I used it as my template for challenging Claude. So use it for those types of categories, the ones that you don't know all of the nuances, you know the least about from the marketplace. AI can help you with the terminology and framework in which you can better converse and ask questions to experts and to expedite your evolution in that particular genre. And lastly, number 5, never, ever use it alone for valuation. It may not, as I said before, have access to all the database sources out there. Many are behind paywalls. or it may mislead you into a value that is not correctly associated to the exact doll that you were even inquiring about. Or lastly, as I mentioned, its data is completely out of date. So we have now those 5 important rules when using AI, but I thought I would also give you 4 great practical applications worth trying just for fun. You know, it really is very interesting, and you can go down a rabbit hole of gathering information, starting off with things you already know. But then having this, I'm putting in quotations, conversation with AI, in my case with Claude, and going into fringe areas, outside areas that you didn't even start with, but it kind of led down that path. And I went on with this with Theriault, I talked about, and how we went down this long path. I've done it with other subjects too, and it's really quite fascinating, quite fun, and very educational if you cross-check, if you're taking it with a grain of salt, and if you have a good base knowledge, I think you'll have a lot of fun. So here's 4 practical applications that are worth kind of trying just for fun in testing out the waters a little bit with AI and feeling how comfortable you are with it. So you might want to ask AI to role play a scenario in buying a doll that you've long wanted to own. You can ask it, where should I look? What to look for? What questions should I ask when seeing that doll? What are some of the price comps? Push it to go further in its analysis as you do it. Pose different scenarios. Ask it where the best odds are of finding a particular doll you're really vying for in a particular condition that you are seeking. That is, where's the best place that I can go? Where's the best chance of finding this? How do I find this at the best possible price? All of these things, role play over and over again in all these different scenarios. It's a great training exercise in you might pick out something, some little tidbit in there. Oh, I never thought of it that way. I never thought of seeking a doll in that particular venue, or I never thought of asking that question about a doll. And it's really kind of fun and fascinating. Second, role play with AI and naming 5 things you love about dolls and figurative art the most, and asking it to name particular makers, categories, or style of dolls you may not have imagined fitting into your vision. So basically saying this, Claude, I like French fashion dolls. I collect primarily French fashion dolls from Theriault, and we used this example earlier. Now, you don't have to go with the economical aspect. You can just go, can you suggest other things in my collection that I should look for to create a more balanced overall view of the 19th century doll? He might go on, obviously, to other French fashions. It will also go on to discussing perhaps the cross-section into French bébés and the evolution there. It might talk about English wooden dolls from the 18th and 17th century. I'm not saying it will, but it's possible, and it may suggest some things of, wow, I never really thought about that, but I see the correlation. I see the connection. So it goes back to the thing we talked about earlier in that AI might actually open up your thought process into categories that you can delve into, research, learn about, keeping your collecting fresh and extending your collecting on to build new communities and new fun. This is a great one. Ask AI to write a description of a doll in your collection for documentation and insurance. Now, you can go back to the episode we had a few episodes ago about documenting your collection and the importance of this. Well, you know, AI can go hand in hand in speeding this up and making that process much easier, and that you can present the doll you have to AI. You can tell basics about it, 24-inch EJ, original costume, brown eyes, give it a picture and say, write me a description of that doll for documentation and insurance. See how it does, and then critically think through the summary to tweak it. This will also allow you, by using your own doll knowledge, to learn what AI is good at and what it's not. You'll be able to see through the cracks, but it will speed the process of your documenting things for yourself, your family, and for even insurance purposes, to not have to sit there laboriously writing every single thing. But do remember, you got to go back and tweak it. You got to add that human element. And finally, ask AI to summarize the particular history of a subcategory. let's take Cupies as an example, which I seem to randomly use all the time in my podcast. You decide you're kind of getting interested in them to talk about not just the Cupies themselves, but also to delve into the culture of Cupie collectors, the prominent moments or prominent historical milestones in the collecting of Cupies and the marketplace. What are some Cupie organizations I could potentially join? What are the most desirable pieces in pricing within that subculture of collecting? So this can help you not just learn about the item, but you can learn about the collector community as well and how it has evolved so you can become more familiar with it as you perhaps enter into it in the future. And as is tradition on The Curious Collector, we end with hot takes. I got to come up with a better name, or at least we got to come up with some hot takes music to go alongside as this comes up. Dun, 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 hot takes. And so I always give 2 hot takes on a subject and little tidbits, little things that don't really fit into the overall conversation, but I want to touch on. One is, and this is really goes into other collectibles. And for the primary audience of doll collectors, you might not understand that a lot of collectibles out there, sports memorabilia, sports cards, coins, stamps, comic books, all of these things, you have a system of grading and you have professional grading companies that do a lot of this. Now, dolls, we don't have that necessarily. The grading tends to be more of an overall 3-dimensional condition assessment. And that's a problem with having what I would call traditional grading companies doing grading levels of 1 through 10 of a particular doll, is that there are so many elements in this 3-dimensional piece that you can't really do it in the same way. You have a comic book, it's pretty simple to do a grading expert eye on this in looking at the original coloring, looking at the condition overall of the paper. All of these things I think is far easier in that sense, and certainly with a baseball card, knowing if the edges are cut, all of that. So grading is actually becoming interesting because it's always been a human element in the aspect of grading. And that is good in one sense, but there's been arguments that human graders tend to be affected by their own particular interpretations of condition. Really, you see the same thing with dolls. You have collectors who are incredibly particular to the point that really they're verging on not really understanding the patina of an antique, and that they are never perfect. They are generally excellent, as Florence has coined that term years ago, with the flip side being, of course, that you have collectors who are far more patient with condition and more accepting of things, and then everybody in between. And graders, professional graders in the areas of sports cards and all these other things we mentioned, not dolls, come with that human element as well. So all of these things factor in. There have been criticisms in the past of particular pieces having one grade from one person of a 8 and another person grading it as a 5 or 6 because they come from 2 different schools of thought. So it wasn't a perfect science. So it's very interesting to watch that you're finding a lot of AI grading now being developed, apps that you can get where you can, for a few dollars, actually post in your photo or piece into this app, and it will within 5 minutes give you a grade on it. Now, that certainly is fast because in the other system, you had to actually send in your piece, and it would often take 4 to 8 weeks to be able to get a return on that as far as the grade. And it would come with a whole document, everything, and it would actually travel with that piece through your collection and when you went to sell it. So these apps speed it up for sure, a lot cheaper for sure. But are they accurate? Not really. There's been a lot of studies on this that they don't always get it right, that the human factor actually is a little bit more understanding of some of the nuances we talked about, and that you can't really from a photograph necessarily look at this piece and be able to grade it accurately. Where it does serve a purpose is this, in that they have found that it's a good starting point. If AI grades your collectible on one of these apps at a 5, you kind of stop to think, is it really worth getting graded at all professionally and send it off and spend all that money? If AI gave it such a rating, I'm going to leave it. Now, if it comes back with a 10, you might say, hey, that's really good, because the value of a 5 grading to a 10 grading can be significantly different. You could be talking about going from $3,000 to $25,000. So at that point, you decide, hey, now it's worth it. I'm going to send it into the human grader. So you see, it's checks and balances, one step after another. That's hot take number 1. Hot take number 2. Hey, if you're an expert in a collecting category, if you've written books, written articles, collected them for years, done every bit of research possible out there, do you really need AI? Well, probably not. If that's all you want to collect, if that's the only thing you are going to do, you probably don't need AI to give you advice on anything within that particular category. If anything, you're going to serve as the stopgap, the end advice of other people who are getting information on AI on that category, coming to you for confirmation. Is it true? Is it right? And you say yes, no, maybe, in between. So no, you don't necessarily need it from that sense, but you could use it for other things. And a perfect example is that Gebrüder Heubach, where I know what the doll is. I know everything about that particular piece. I know what that doll was particularly made for, but AI gave me something in a different element that I was not an expert on, and that is the textile. I didn't realize. I had a feeling it was Norwegian, but didn't understand where the potential possibility of the villages it came from in Norway, given certain different identifying factors on the outfit. So that's pretty powerful stuff. So you don't need it as an expert, but I think it can give you a few little things out there that you never thought of before. So the verdict is AI is useful for collecting. You should be doing it. You should be taking it with a grain of salt. You should be cautious with it, but have fun with it. Don't take it as the gospel. Utilize it for yourself as another little adjunct, another little part of collecting that can guide your evolution and guide your journey. I think it's actually kind of fun too. If you go on and practice with it a little bit, just have random fun, not making any critical decisions, just entering in some things and letting it lead on into conversation about different genres of dolls. I think you're going to find it very fascinating. And I think it's going to become, for you as a collector, one of the best research assistants you could have ever hired. Not one, but 1,000 of them lined up, waiting, that have read every book, read everything out there in the world, and they're ready to offer your thoughts. They're not always going to be right, but they're going to be thoughts nonetheless. And it can lead to a really engaging and fun evolution in the world of collecting.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.